to start back up again with Five Stalks of Grain and the Holodomor. So this is from my center, which is the Center for Russian, East European, and Eurasian Studies. I think all of you have your book on your table. Zoom people, don't worry, we're going to mail you your books. This was my first experience reading a graphic novel, and I was blown away by this book. I really feel like this could be taught anywhere from middle school all the way through college. It's a really rich text. There's so much there. So I'll tell you a little bit about the book as we go through and go through the lesson plan. So this is the cover. You'll notice it's black and white. The entire book is black and white, and we'll talk about that. But it talks about the Holodomor. And the first way that I wanted to start the lesson, and this is kind of what Sam talked about, which, don't just pour water in an empty vessel, but let the students talk to you. I want to know what the students already know about Ukraine. Maybe it's nothing. Maybe they just know there's a war, but I would like to know, what do they already know? Because sometimes they can surprise you, right? And it just kind of gives you a sense on what sort of context you want to give them. So my lesson plan will come with 2 separate PowerPoints, and those PowerPoints on each slide, there's probably too many notes for you, but I'd rather you have too much than too little. So we'll ask them, what do you know about Ukraine, right? And see what they can either say it out loud, they can write it down, they can put it on the board, and then you can give a little bit of context to kind of fill in the gaps. So you can tell them about, this is where it is, this is where it's located. I'm sure they've seen the flag all around Lawrence and elsewhere right now. And then you can kind of give them some context in terms of the United States and Ukraine, right? So tell them about the size. This is what it would be if it was shoved into the East Coast. And just kind of let them know where they're dealing with before we start talking about the what. And then before we get started, I want to ask, has anyone heard of the Holodomor? Because a lot of people haven't. And it's kind of crazy to me and a lot of scholars of the Holodomor that people haven't. Everyone's heard of the Holocaust, but people haven't heard of the Holodomor. So the word Holodomor comes from the Ukrainian word holod, which means starvation, and the word mariti, which means to exterminate. So mariti holodom, to exterminate via hunger or starvation. So the Holodomor was a famine in Ukraine in 1932 and 1933. And it was not a famine that was caused by bad weather, bad harvest. This was a man-made famine. And I think 20 countries recognize it as a genocide. So it was an intentional famine to basically exterminate the Ukrainian people in the Soviet Union. We won't watch this, but there's a great video from the Holodomor Studies website, and this is one of the resources that is listed in your resource list. But this video, I'll have you start by having your students watch this. It's about 11 minutes, and this will give them like a very quick but what they need to know, right? Introduction to what this event was, right? A little bit of the history, because again, this isn't a history class, we're talking about literature. So give them a historical context. And you can review terms that might be unfamiliar to them. So some of the words that are used in this video are gulag, which was the Soviet camps, kulak, which was a rich peasant. It comes from the Russian word for fist. And so one of the resources I have is Cultural References PowerPoint, which I'll show you. And so I have slides on all of these terms with some pictures and then all the notes, so you can explain these things to them, so you don't have to go and do a ton of research. So there are slides on there. So after that, I want to talk about, right, the victims of the Holodomor. And so this is one of the slides from the teacher PowerPoint. So you may have heard that Ukraine is called the breadbasket of Europe, or the breadbasket of the Soviet Union. It has really rich, dark, black soil, which is great for growing crops. And so it's amazing that in the most fertile land in Europe, at the height of the famine, people were dying at a rate of 17 minutes per day, 1,000 per hour, or 25,000 per day. 3 million were children. And so there are different accounts, right? Because of course, not all of these deaths were recorded, but I've heard anywhere from 3 to 10 or 5 to 10 million based on different accounts. So the current estimate is about, right, 4.6 to 5 million people that died during the Holodomor. And so what this novel does, this graphic novel, is it traces the story of two children, Nadia and Taras, their brother and sister. Their father's arrested, their mother's shot for hoarding grain, and I'll talk about that too in a second. And so their goal is to try to get out of their village and go to the city, because the city is where they're going to find food. And so this novel follows all of their trials and tribulations on the way to get to the city, and what they see along the way. So one of the questions that I think is important to talk about with this book is not only what was the Holodomor, that's the first question, but also how can food be used as a weapon? Because it really can. So this picture is of the Holodomor Memorial in Washington, D.C. And you can talk about some images from the novel. There's one page where you can see the image of a barefoot and starving man asking for food as a man in a business suit walks by. So you can really see that this is not, a famine created by nature. This is a famine that's man-made, and it's based on who you are, basically. It was Ukrainians were targeted. It was one way that Stalin wanted to kind of wipe out Ukrainian nationalism and Ukrainian culture, because he felt it was a threat to like the Soviet model, right? The Soviet idea. So people were even, they didn't want them to speak Ukrainian anymore. And we'll talk about kind of generational trauma and what that means later as a health issue related to the Holodomor. But this is really what's going on here. So you can see that grain is taken. There's another image of grain being taken from Ukrainians. So these Ukrainian farmers, they used to have their own farms. And then during the Soviet Union, there was something called collectivization, where they wanted to have collective farms, everyone worked together. And sounds great in theory, but in practice, it was all of these people are working on these farms. They have insane quotas for production, unreasonable quotas. And so everything was taken by the Soviets, right? And it was given to the cities, or it was sold abroad. So the people who are growing this food are, they can't eat it. If they saved anything for themselves, it was called grain hoarding, and they were either arrested or executed on the spot. And so the kids in the novel, their parents, their father was arrested for not joining the collective farm because there was a huge resistance in Ukraine, in rural Ukraine, to the collectivization movement. And then their mother is accused of hoarding grain. We never see her hoarding grain, she's just accused of it. So that's another thing that happens, right? Is that people can be accused of something and there's no evidence, but there still are repercussions. So all of this grain, and you'll see on one of the pictures, is stockpiled and given away to the cities or sold abroad. So the name of the novel is Five Stalks of Grain. And there was kind of a law that said, if you are caught hoarding even 5 stalks of grain, you could get sentenced to the gulag or more or worse. So that's where that came from. So this is a great discussion that you can have, and it doesn't have to just relate to food. You could just talk about resources in general, but how do power systems use food and resources as a weapon to control or eliminate populations? So I think that's an important question to talk to your students about. And so after, this is kind of a 3-day lesson plan that I've created. And so the first day is really just going to be talking about the Holodomor, kind of giving historical context, talking about what happened and why it happened. And so then the first night, I'll have them read the novel. The novel you can read in a half an hour. There's very little text, but you can, this novel, like I said, can be taught all the way through college because it's so rich. So the first night that they read it, I want them just to think about the basics, right? Where and when does this story take place? They know it takes place in Ukraine in the 1930s. We've already kind of told them this. What happens in the novel? So think about all the different things that happen, what the children endure. Who are the characters? Who are the main characters? Like I said, there's 2, Nadia and Taras. Who are other important people in the novel, even if they're not considered a protagonist? And then what themes do you notice in the novel? And that's kind of the main topic. One of the main questions is the theme, right? What do we notice? So on day 2, we talk about the themes. So you'll start class by asking them, why do you think the novel is called Five Stalks of Grain? In that video, the contextual historical video that I have them watch, it talks about the rule, the 5 stalks of grain. So you can ask them, why do you think it's called this? Would you have called it something else based on your reading? Why or why not? So I think this is a good way to just kind of like ease into talking about it. You can touch on some themes, you can touch on plot, right? But it's kind of like an easy way to get them talking about it. After that, we can dive in and talk about the characters. So like I said, the 2 characters are Nadia and her brother Taras. So this is where that cultural references PowerPoint comes in, because these names are actually really important. And it's not something that you would think of, right? But the names are important. So Nadia comes from the Ukrainian word Nadia, which means hope. So we're basically following the journey of hope through the Holodomor, through to the end. And you can't see it because that's in the way, but Taras is another important name. So her little brother is named Taras. And that is a name that became popular in Ukraine because it's associated with their national poet, whose name is Taras Shevchenko. And he was well known for unifying, as a unifying figure for the Ukrainian nation. So naming your son Taras kind of became a way to signify allegiance to the Ukrainian nation. So you can ask them, why do you think the author would give these names to these characters? So there's already, we haven't even talked about what happens, and there's already just so much depth in this novel. So after we talk about who these people are, we talk about what happens to them. So there's different ways to do this, right? I always like to get my students out of their seats, because I feel like if, maybe you feel that way now, if someone talks at you for too long, you just kind of glaze over. So one way you could do it, right? I have all the major plot points here. So you could each give them a piece of paper with one of the plot points and have them like get up and physically put themselves in order. So that's a good way to kind of have them be like, okay, I'm like actually moving. Sometimes with middle schoolers, that might be complete chaos. I don't know. But that's one way to do it. Or you can just have them write it down, talk to a partner. You could give them pictures from the novel and have them put those in order as well, either on a, work with a partner and do it on your table in small pictures, or again, physically stand up if you want them to do that that way. Then we talk about the different themes of the novel. So I'll go through the plot quickly. So Nadia and Taras, right? It opens with their father is arrested for refusing to join the kolkhoz, that's the collective farm. Then on the next page, their mother is killed in front of them while they're hiding. So they hear a knock at the door, and immediately the mother knows, knock at the door, you need to hide. They hide in like a chest where they keep old coats and things like that. And so they say, you've been hiding grain. She said, what are you talking about? Where are your kids? They're in the city. So she says, my kids aren't even here. They shoot her, and then Nadia and Taras, they see it. And we'll talk about trauma in a minute. But so they set out to find means of survival, right? Because their parents are no longer there to take care of them. There's no food. So they go on this kind of epic journey to find food, and they're going to go to the city, right? Because everything is in the city. The city is kind of this place where they can survive. Then they meet secret police on their way. And so they're trying to escape him because they're not supposed to be moving around, right? One of the things that happened that made this famine so horrible is that not only was all the food taken, but people were required to have internal passports to move around. So you really weren't allowed to leave where you lived. So rural people couldn't go to the city. And then eventually it became that you couldn't leave Ukraine. So it was really concentrated. So these kids are wandering around illegally. And so a man says, okay, I have bread. Come with me. And of course, they're children, they're going to follow. Well, as you can think of, what would happen with a famine is cannibalism. So he's going to hurt them and eat them, but they escape. Oh, I think I might be skipping something. So they get out, they go, and there's a point where Nadia tells her little brother how their father received the Order of the Red Banner medal. This was a medal that was really important for bravery in battle. So this is another theme that we'll talk about, which is relating family history and legacy and like holding on to to where you came from and who your family, who your nation, who those things are. They meet young pioneers in the city. Young pioneers were a communist youth group, basically. Think about like commie Boy Scouts. And Nadia doesn't recognize the pin. She says, oh, where's that pin from? And they're like, okay, immediately I know that you don't belong here. So they call them enemies of the people and they run away again. Unfortunately, Taras gets caught in a fence and left behind. Nadia's alone. She follows an owl. There's an old woman's house. The woman tells her about toll houses, which we'll talk about, bribes a guard to take her to the city. They stop at a warehouse. She sees where all the grain has been stored. That's going to go abroad. That's going to go. And she's just completely overwhelmed. People, counter-revolutionaries, shoot the men taking Nadia. She runs away. She doesn't trust them. And they basically tell her, oh, your brother's not in the city. He's gone. She doesn't believe them. She keeps going forward. And the novel ends with her looking at like a bird flying into the sun over the train track. And then we go 61 years later, her descendants visit her home and find like a journal and learn her story. So it's an intense novel for sure, which is why I wouldn't necessarily say that you could read it with like elementary school students. I would say more junior high. So after, during their reading journal, right, you've had them talk about what are the themes of the novel. So I have a list of themes on this slide for you, but some of them that you might notice would be survival, obviously, both physical survival and the survival of a story, the survival of an idea, of a family history, of a nation's history, hope and perseverance in the face of extreme adversity, right? So Nadia, her name means hope, and she's surviving this entire time. The idea of family and family history, the idea of trauma and intergenerational trauma, inherited trauma, which we'll talk about, identity, transformation. Transformation is a huge theme in this novel. And then the soul's journey. So I mentioned that the old woman tells Nadia about toll houses. So she says, have you heard about toll houses? And Nadia says no. And basically what the toll house is, it's a belief in Orthodoxy that after someone dies, their soul goes on a journey to heaven. And the soul is tested along the way. And they meet different, demons that accuse the soul of sin. And the meetings happen at toll houses. So the demons are trying to pull the soul back to hell, and the soul is trying to go forward. So this was kind of one of the illustrator and the author talked about how this was kind of a central idea to the novel. There's an icon here, which is the death of Saint Theodosia, and it's based on this idea of the soul being tested. So in the cultural resource or cultural references PowerPoint, I have that icon and a lot of information about that. I won't give it all to you right now, but that's kind of a central thing here. So there's this religious undertone to the entire thing. Religion was something that the Soviets tried to dissolve, right? And so they said, oh, we're a secular state, there is no more religion. So they tried to make this secular religion of communism and Leninism, but that didn't work for a lot of people. So one way of having these icons show up in the novel is a way of kind of keeping that religion and cultural aspect alive. I think the illustrator said our culture and our religion go hand in hand, so it's really important for these to like make an appearance in the novel. So you'll talk about different themes, and then you can talk to the students, what toll houses do you think Nadia and Taras encounter on their journey, right? What ways are they tested? And they're tested many times over. So Nadia, you can see her when they're running away from the man that tries to hurt them in the beginning. She could have run and left her brother, but she didn't, right? So that's one way that she was tested. There's a drawing of her pushing her brother in front of her, and she's kind of on the ground. So she's putting her family, her loved ones before her. So that's one way that she's tested. Again, in the novel, when the counter-revolutionaries, they shoot the men taking her, and they're saying, do you know who these people are? They're awful. And she says, I know, they've destroyed my town. They said, well, then you should be the one to pull the trigger. And so this is another way where she is tempted by sin, by revenge, by anger, by hunger, by trauma, and she refuses. She says, no, you're the demons, right? They're bad, but you're just as bad. You think you're doing right. So there's a lot of ways where these kids are tested on their way. And then, of course, because this is global health through literature, you want to talk about health issues. Now, the physical health issues with famine are kind of obvious, right? But food shortage, as Araceli mentioned, is something that people in the United States experience every day. So you can talk about that, but I really focused more on the mental health, about the idea of trauma and transformation, about the idea of inherited trauma. So there's this photo here is from Kharkov, right? And so trauma, right, is a response to a devastating event, and it can result in physical issues and things like anxiety, depression, PTSD, heart disease. But then also subsequent generations can inherit that trauma. So people, descendants of Holodomor survivors, they irrationally hoard food, right? They think children need to be fed. You can't be skinny. You can't, there's this inherent distrust of authority. And there's even this kind of sense of like national inadequacy, right? Or shame of their nationality, because they were told you can't be Ukrainian, you can't speak Ukrainian language. Ukrainian is just a rural hick dialect of Russian, and they were trying to make Ukrainian sound more Russian. So there's just really this sense of inferiority too, that's part of that trauma. There's also evidence of kind of Stockholm syndrome with Holodomor survivors and their descendants, thinking that there's like a deformation of their worldview. They're focusing on Soviet values, and Stockholm syndrome is kind of a way to survive, right? It's much easier to survive if you are not in constant battle with what you're being told, but if you believe. And so that kind of goes into the fear of using Ukrainian language. Oh, I shouldn't use Ukrainian, it's not as good of a language, or I'll get in trouble if I speak Ukrainian. So this famine not only destroyed lives, but it also was a real blow to Ukrainian culture too, and the idea of Ukrainian culture. So you can talk a lot about generational trauma with your students as well. And I have a lot more information about that in the PowerPoint too. Then the novel doesn't end with this, amazing picture of Nadia walking off into the sunset following a bird. Instead, it ends with her descendants coming to her house. So you could ask them, why do you think it's important that Nadia's family visits her house 61 years later? So 61 years later would make this 1993, 1994, so after the collapse. So that would be something else in that cultural PowerPoint that I mentioned that gives you this context, right? So you can talk about the collapse of the Soviet Union in 91. That means that Ukraine is now an independent nation. So why is it important that these people are able to be here? Why is it important to know the history of your family, or not just your family, but of your nation? How does an event like this shape identity, right? So this is something that you could talk about in the context of the Holodomor, but you could also, if you want, bring it back to your students and say, what are events and maybe where you're from, the history of your country, whether it's the United States or not, that shape your identity, right? You think about how we celebrate the 4th of July. We did this a few days ago. That's a big holiday here, but not so much in Britain, right? But it's something, it's like huge to American identity for whatever reason, right? And I have a resource on here too, where you can share some clips of interviews with children of Holodomor survivors. They're like 2-minute long clips. There's a whole list of them, and I'll show that to you here in a second, but that link is on our site. So if you want to hear the actual voices of these people, they talk about all sorts of things. What this holiday means to them now, what Easter or Christmas, based on how they grew up, different things like that. So to actually hear their voices is really powerful. If you want, right, you could talk about, how do you think this event shapes Ukraine's feelings about Russia as a motivation during this ongoing war too? Because there's a history there, right? the Russian war on Ukraine didn't start on February 24th, 2022. It started a long, long time ago. So that's another important thing about talking about knowing this story, telling this story, saying it out loud. One article I read about generational trauma said that the people who are most traumatized by the Holodomor do not talk about it. And then they don't talk about it with their children, and so their children are more traumatized, right? Because they feel like they can't talk about the trauma. It's just all internalized, and we all know that that's not a good thing. And they noticed that the people who talk about it more showed fewer symptoms of PTSD and trauma. So one way to kind of combat generational trauma is to put words on it, to say it out loud, to recognize what happened, right? The first step is recognizing that something happened, right? And then you can process it. And then if you want, I know it's tricky getting into their personal lives, but you could say, are there parts of your family history that inform your identity? If you don't want to talk about family because that can be difficult, you can say of, your country's history. Are there things in the past that shape your identity? If you want to, you can talk about that. So then I want them to read the novel again, right? Or at least look through it, because first we read for just information. Who are the characters? What happens? Where is this taking place? And then I want them to look at the visuals because they're fascinating. This novel is incredible. So how do the images in the novel relate to the themes that we discussed? How do the stylistic choices affect the reader? Because there are some definite stylistic choices. And then I want them to choose an image. Which image of this whole novel struck you the most and why? So those are the things they're going to look for the second time they read it. So you could start the third day, right, by showing, if you want, talking about which image struck you personally, and then going around the room and saying, this one really spoke to me and here's why, if you want to do that. And then I want to talk about how the illustrator presents the novel's themes visually. What sorts of things does she focus on? What sorts of things repeat? What about the use of color or lack thereof? Because this whole novel is black and white. So you'll see that birds repeat a lot, but also contrasting colors, and the illustrator really focuses on hands and eyes. Those repeat a ton in this novel. So the eyes, right, they're windows to the soul. They're windows into somebody's mind. You want to know how somebody's feeling, you look in their eyes, right? And I think this image is incredibly powerful. This is when Nadia and Taras are hiding in the chest with all the coats, and they see what's going on. You can't see it maybe on the screen, but reflected in the eyes is what's going on, is like the hand of the guard that kills their mother. So you get a physical representation of the trauma and the transformation. And one way that the author enhances this idea of transformation is through color. So all throughout the novel before this, right, you get images where the lines of the image are black and the background is white. All of a sudden, when you have this traumatic event, it switches and everything is in black with white lines. So it really shows that there's something drastic happening, and it's not just an internal thing, it's really physically transforming these people. And so you can see this image is really powerful too, right? So they are in this black and white switched, right? White lines, black background, and then they step out and they go back. So they've been transformed and now they're stepping back out into life, into this next journey, right? But they're never going to be the same again. You can see that physical transformation and mental transformation that happens to them after this trauma. So another theme that we talked about was hope and perseverance in the face of adversity. And so the author uses birds a lot to show kind of this idea of hope or the soul. So you can see, right, she starts out, she's traumatized, right, just on this one page, and then she slowly gets up, and then finally she's able to kind of walk off into the distance. So there's very little text in this, but the images just, they say so much too. So you can kind of see that there. see what else. Like I mentioned, birds repeat a lot too, and they kind of become symbols, right, of the soul. So when Nadia finally makes it to the end of her journey, you saw that bird, right? She's following the bird off into the distance. When she's talking to her brother Taras, when they're cold and they're hungry and they're hunkered down, she said, do you remember those bird calls that Mama taught us? And so they're recalling their mother with the bird. And then right before Nadia walks off into the sunset, she's starving, right? But she can, maybe you can't see, but she feeds some grain to a bird. The bird does its bird call, and then she walks off into the distance. So this connection with the soul and freedom and flying high, and also connecting to her descendants. On the last page, I think, of the novel, yes, here, this isn't Nadia, this is her descendant. Her descendant sees a bird after she discovers that, where is it? This journal, right? She sees this journal, she learns the family history, she's there at the house where her relatives grew up. She sees this, and then at the very end, she sees a bird fly off. And so we think maybe this is Nadia's soul. So what I thought would be an interesting assignment, right, is to have them create their own graphic novel, not hundreds of pages long, but a couple panels maybe, based on one of the themes from Five Stalks of Grain. So you could assign them a theme, or you could have them choose their own, whichever one spoke to them. It could be based on their lives, it could be based on history, it could be completely made up, but just thinking about that theme and how they want to embody it, right? And then to accompany the graphic novel, write a page or two explaining how your novel embodies that theme. What stylistic choices did you make? How did they portray their theme? Are the characters' names important, perhaps, in the novel, and why? What visual references inspired your novel in terms of artwork? So these are some things. So you have a writing component and you also have a visual component. If you don't want them to draw, or if they can't draw because it's maybe not an art class, you could just have them pick pictures off the internet or out of magazines or something like that, so they don't have to freak out about trying to draw something. But really trying to think of the visual and how it ties into themes. So I do have a list of resources. These are all going to be on the crees.ku.edu/globalhealth, the website that you registered for. So the cultural reference is PowerPoint, and I'll show you a couple examples of those slides. There's the video that I mentioned at the beginning there's also, oh no, not that at the beginning, but there's a video with an interview with the author and with the illustrator, which is fascinating. It's really wonderful to hear them talk about how they were inspired to do this, why they chose a graphic novel, why she chose black and white. One reason she chose black and white was because, think about if this had been in color and there's, images of someone getting stabbed and bleeding, like it's a lot more graphic and maybe even cartoonish or maybe too realistic if it's in color. But by having it in black and white, it's not going to be as graphic to the reader. That was one reason why she chose that. She talks a lot about her visual reference and iconography and everything too. There's some historical photos of the Holodomor. You can go and look through photos. I have an educator unit on how starvation is used as a political weapon during the Holodomor. So if you are not a literature person, but you're more of a social studies history person, you can really focus more on that. There's a ton of resources here, lots of videos, more educational resources on the Holodomor in terms of genocide studies. And then there's a link to, like I said, interviews with children of Holodomor survivors. So this is just an example of one of the slides from the cultural references PowerPoint that I keep mentioning, right? So it shows a page from the novel, and this is something I assume that like the average American reader would not get, right? So where's that pin from? The Young Pioneers. Most people aren't gonna know what that is. So I have in the notes section on PowerPoint, there's a ton of info for you, not a ton, but enough. Information in there on the Young Pioneers. It tells you the translation of this poster, right? So it says, we are the pioneers of the Soviet nation, and there's millions of us, right? And our advisor is the Komsomol, and the Komsomol was like, once you aged out of the Young Pioneers, you moved up to the Komsomol. And then this pin. So if you were in the Young Pioneers, you would have this pin. This is Lenin. And it says "Всегда готов," which means always prepared, always ready, kind of like the American Boy Scouts, but they're ready for something completely different. Right, so it was not technically compulsory to be in the Young Pioneers, but basically you should be in the Young Pioneers. So the fact that Nadia and Taras don't recognize the pin makes makes this girl think, okay, something's up. They're enemies of the people, not good Soviet-minded boys and girls. And then enemies of the state is another phrase that your students might not be familiar with. So it was basically a way to denounce people, right? If you're politically opposed to the Soviet Union, enemy of the state, right? People related or close to enemies of the state were considered suspicious too, and they were avoided. A lot of people were imprisoned and some were executed for being enemies of the state.